go to Mount Carmel. Anyway, it says at this particular time that Ahab and Jezebel have pretty much eliminated the other prophets of Yahweh, either by killing them or by making them so scared that they're not doing anything anymore. So it says the last one of those is Elijah. It says even in chapter 18, verse 4, it says, when Jezebel was murdering the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah, another guy, hid 100 of them. There's about 100 that are afraid of speaking. So they're hidden out in a cave by order. So Ahab and especially Jezebel are saying, let's get rid of these prophets of Yahweh. Anyway, on Mount Carmel, you know the story. It's Jezebel's, Elijah says to the people, you got to choose a side. You can't have two gods and do some of these things that we're not supposed to do. So you're either with me or not. And then they say, all right, let's see which God accepts our sacrifice. So he tells the prophets of Baal to make an altar and put some meat on it and offer it to God and see if it gets taken, consumed. And of course it doesn't. It's there. Elijah makes fun of him. Oh, yell louder. Maybe your God's asleep or something. Anyway, but nothing happens. Then Elijah puts a sacrifice on the altar and prays to God and says fire comes down and consumes the sacrifice, showing that this is the real God. So that, when you hear Elijah versus the prophets of Baal, that is the story told in chapter 18 of 1 Kings. So, we hear those stories every now and then in church. The stories of Elijah with the widow and her son, Elijah with the prophets of Baal, and then also the story that after that he still wanted the king and queen, want to eliminate him. It says he goes to Horeb, another name for Mount Sinai, so that's a long trip. He goes there, probably afraid for his life. And then this story we also have in a reading on Sunday. It says, excuse me, he's waiting to hear from God, and it says there's like an earthquake, but God doesn't speak in the earthquake, and then there's a huge wind, and God doesn't speak then, and then there's a big storm, and doesn't speak then. Then he hears a tiny whispering sound, and that's when God speaks to him. So that's a story for us, too, to say, don't just look for God in the incredible events of life. God speaks to us in the normal, everyday things. But anyway, he is told what to do. And he's going to go back and say that this other guy is supposed to be king. He's also going to appoint a successor for himself. And that successor is going to be Elisha. So those of you who are electors, if you're ever reading from this, make sure you know there's an Elijah and an Elisha. Two different people. So he is told to do a couple of things at the end of that section. I'm in verse 16 or so. Yeah, chapter 19, verse 16. Anoint Jehu as the new king of Israel. And then also Elisha as your successor. So it says that Elisha is out plowing with his oxen. And Elijah says, follow me, the last chapter of chapter 19, last paragraph. And it says, Elisha says, well, let me say goodbye to my family. And Elijah says, no, you got to be right away. Again, to tell us the immediacy, the importance of the role that you're going to have. So when it says that he slaughters his yoke of oxen and plowing equipment for burning, I mean, that would be like you burning your buildings and killing your livestock. I mean, so he's done with that way of life. He's devoted full time now to being the successor to Elijah. So now we go back to Ahab the king, and in chapter 20 it's going to talk about some of his military battles. And then in 21 we get the neat story of the other way that Jezebel gets her bad reputation. So first, she convinced her husband to give up his belief in Yahweh, follow her God. Second, she orders the execution of a lot of the prophets of Yahweh. And now third, it says she wants this land that's right next to the king's property. This is a vineyard there, and a young man named Naboth owns it and farms it. So Ahab, the king, goes and asks Naboth, can I buy your property? I'll either trade you for, I'll find another piece of property that's even better, you can have that, or I'll give you a really good price for it. And Naboth says it's my ancestral heritage, meaning, I got this from my parents who got it from their parents and so on. So, no, I want to stay here. He's a young man, so he's not married, hasn't any kids yet. So Ahab goes back and he's very sad, and Jezebel says, what's the matter? And he says, well, you won't sell. And then Jezebel says, okay, I'll take care of this. So she gets what we would call stationery, but gets some letters and puts the king's seal on it, sends it to the people of the town. It says, have a nice assembly. Say we're going to have this party where we're going to offer prayers to God or whatever. And anyway, and have Naboth there and have him at the head of the table. So they do that, and then she says she hires 2 scoundrels. So what does it take to be a scoundrel? But anyway, she said, all right, I need 2 scoundrels while we're at this meal to come in and say that they heard David curse God and king, which is punishable by death if it's heard by 2 witnesses. So that's why she needed 2 scoundrels to come in and do that. So during this, they come in, they say, we heard Naboth curse God and curse the king. So he's stoned to death. And since he has no family to give his land to, the king and queen inherit it. So that is how Jezebel gets the land, the vineyard. So the kids always thought, oh, so Jezebel, she got her way a lot of times. But
Times when they went into the Holy Land, they were doing the same thing. I want your stuff, I'm gonna take it.
So that's her story there of how, you always feel sorry for Naboth, the nice young guy who's taking care of land and winds up dying. All right, and then, so then chapter 22, some further campaigns, which means fighting, and then we finish with Jehoshaphat, is the son of Asa. He takes over Judah towards the end there, while Ahab is king in the north, and then we have Ahaziah, another one, and then he also does evil, behaving like their father and so on, worshiping Baal. So this book ends with worshiping Baal, provoking God just as their fathers had done. So most of the kings do that. And again, they just chose this as a spot to say, all right, since it's a long book, that's the end of the first half, now we'll start the second half. So we'll do 2 Kings. So Ahab dies. His wife, we'll see, is still around. We will see that one of the prophets said that she was going to have a bad death, so we'll see that later. Anyway, more kings. Death of 2 captains, death of this king. Elijah and Elisha. So in chapter 2 there is the story of Elijah. Is the only guy in the Old Testament. It doesn't say he dies. It just says he was taken up like in a chariot, or whatever that may mean. But Elisha, when asked what he might want, says, "Oh, I'd love a double portion of the spirit that you have." And Elijah says, "Well, if you see me when I die or when I leave, you'll be able to get that." And it says they're together there once, and Elijah is taken up like in a chariot. So that's the end of Elijah, and now we focus on Elisha. And to begin with him, they tell miracle stories of him. So again, Elijah and Elisha are the only 2 prophets of the Old Testament that do miracles. That's why we hear of them in the New Testament, because they perform miracles which foreshadow what we believe Jesus did. One of the kids' favorite stories, kids meaning high school kids, they call them kids even though they're but anyway, they always like the story at the end of chapter 2, the last paragraph. I'll let you go ahead and read that quickly. The last paragraph, when it says, "From there Elisha went up to Bethel," and then after you're done reading it, I'll tell you what that means. Now, I obviously teach that didn't happen. It's a story, though, meant for something. And when I ask high school kids, what's the purpose of this story, what do you suppose they always said? You have an answer?
Don't make fun of
Yeah, that's what high school kids always say. Yes.
Don't make
Don't
fun of
bully.
Yes. So don't make fun of people. That's part of it.
Husband can-
That's not the number one answer, but it is what all high school kids say. Oh yeah, they make fun of this guy and two bears come out and kill a bunch of them. Okay, yeah, so you shouldn't make fun of people. That is like the number 3 purpose of the story. And that's why in this little paragraph, yeah, you tell lots of things with lots of different meaning. While I'm at it of telling a story about Elisha, I'll remind you, yeah, don't make fun of people. But it's to show, first of all, Elijah is a prophet with great power, and you don't make fun of him, especially if he can do great things. Okay, because obviously there's problems with stories. If 2 bears came out, I think we'd probably run away before 42 of us got killed, right?
You could go away, Baldy.
No.
And 42 again is around 7 times 6 or 14 times 3 is 42, so that meaning. But yeah, so don't make fun of people is an okay part, but the main part is, hey, this shows that Elisha is really a powerful person we should listen to. Listen to any prophet as far as that goes, but especially Elisha. All right, and then it talks about Moab is a small bordering country. And then chapter 4 and 5 are miracles performed by Elisha, 4, 5, and the first part of 6. If you want to read them, Kim, one is about how this widow is going to run out of oil, and she needs it. She's got 2 sons that are going to have to become sold into slavery because she can't pay off her debts. And Elisha says, get all the empty jars you can from your neighbors. So they go out and they bring back all these empty jars. And then he says, all right, pour the oil from your jar into that. And he fills them all. And oil is valuable, so they're able to sell the oil jars and pay off their debts so the kids don't be slaves. And there's a few others, one there. Multiplication of loaves is worth noting because it obviously is a fulfillment, is a foreshadowing of what Jesus does. And you probably have heard, one of the Sunday readings in church is the story of Naaman, the Syrian, chapter 5. So he's a person with leprosy, and here this is kind of nice. It does show he's not a Jew. But he wants to come to the king of Israel and say, what can I do? Can your God do anything for me? The king tears his cloak. Whenever you tear your cloak, it means one of 2 things. Either you're seeking forgiveness, or in this case, you've heard bad news. He says, I'm not a God. I can't cure your leprosy. Why are you coming to me? And he said, well, get Elisha. Maybe he can do something. Anyway, Elisha says, wash in the river 7 times. Anyway, and the guy says, well, aren't the waters back home good enough to do that? Actually, the waters back home are clearer than the Jordan. But anyway, he's cured, and so Elisha does something, but also it's first time hearing it, this guy can be a good person, even though he's not one of us. It's one of the few examples we hear of that. So, and Jesus refers to both of those stories. Remember the one time where they're asking him, and he says, don't you remember? Sometimes he'll say, you remember in what we call the Old Testament? Remember the story of Elijah? As a matter of fact, you might even hear that this week. Anyway, he says, remember the story of Elijah? Who did he stay with? Well, the widow of Zarephath and her son. They weren't us. And how about Elisha? Who did he cure? It was Naaman the Syrian. So there are instances in here of all this stuff about how bad other people are. It's instances where they give us a kind of a foreshadowing of what Jesus is going to say. The widow and her son were really good people, even though they weren't like us. This Naaman the Syrian had great faith, even though he's not one of us. So there are...
Well, Naaman the Syrian had a Jewish girl in the family as a servant girl, I believe.
Yes. And that's why he thinks maybe there's hope.
She said, well,
Yeah.
Here's what you need to do.
Hopefully there's hope from her God. But you will notice that Jesus points out those 2 examples when he talks about the prophets of the Old Testament. And it is interesting, obviously, for us as Christians, of all this stuff, what is it that Jesus points to and gives examples of? He doesn't refer to great kings who killed people. He refers to cases of generosity and charity. So we'll catch more of that as time goes on. All right, we got more reigns and other kings coming on. In chapter 9, Elisha. So Elijah was told to make Jehu the new king. He doesn't get that done, but his successor Elisha does. So Jehu becomes the next king. He does some good things. He gets rid of Ahab's descendants so that we don't have them as possible future kings who could lead us further astray. There's some killing that goes on here, and Jezebel dies at the end of chapter 9. She is no longer queen because her husband is dead and Jehu now is king. And but she's still living pretty well. It says that she's in an upper room, so if you were upstairs, it meant you were in a pretty good house because most buildings didn't have 2 stories. Anyway, and it says that she's got shadowed her eyes and adorned her hair. Only rich people did that. Anyway, when Jehu comes in, she figures, okay, they're here to get me. So she yells something out the window at him, and her death is pretty quick. Jehu looks up and says, "Is there anybody up there on my side?" Then throw her out. She dies getting thrown out of the upstairs. So that's the end of Jezebel. And Ahab's descendants die in chapter 10. And then Jehu, even in the middle of chapter 10, destroys a temple to Baal that had been built up in the north. So he even says, let's have, he's lying, but he said, let's have an assembly and have all these people who worship Baal come. So they come to the temple, and then he says, actually, make sure everybody who comes, give them these clothes to wear so that they stand out. And anyway, then he gets all of his people out, and then he said, we'll kill all the people inside because they're all followers of Baal. So that's one of the things that Jehu does. More kings to follow. And again, after each one, he dies. The rest of his acts are in the books of Chronicles. He rested with his ancestors, meaning he died and was buried. Sometimes, every now and then, somebody be buried in Samaria, because that's the capital city of the north. The kings of Judah are buried in Jerusalem. So, if you look through all the headings in chapter 13, 14, and 15, they're all about new kings. 17, all of them. All that's new kings. It gives a quick summary of what they did while they were king. Nobody really stands out, with the exception of Josiah. And he is coming up. Really, Asa is the only one that's been looked upon favorably so far. We're going to get the other 2 here. In my Bible, before chapter 18, it says, the kingdom of Judah after 721. And the reason for that is, in chapter 17, there is a stronger empire called the Assyrian Empire. If you study world history, you can see this is their time. And in chapter 17, it talks about how the king of Assyria, let's go to chapter 17 yet, verse 5. The king of Assyria arrested. He then occupied the whole land and attacked Samaria, which he besieged for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria. So Samaria falls. And he deported the Israelites to Assyria, settling them in all these other places. Verse 7, why did this happen? So the author gives his commentary here, and it says it's because of all the sins of the people. They did everything possible, verses 7 through 12. There are all these bad things that they did against God. That's the reason for their downfall. So in 721, so remember, we had under Solomon, under Saul, David, and Solomon, we had one country. Solomon dies, we divide in 2, we're arguing over who replaces him. For 200 years, we have these 2 countries, all these kings of one of the other that have been mentioned here in what we talked about tonight. Now in 721 BC, that northern kingdom gets taken over by Assyria. There is no more Israel. Israel is taken over by Assyria. It mentions some of their kings, Tiglath-Pileser, Sennacherib, Sargon. Those are kings of Assyria. Anyway, in 721, that happens, and a lot of the inhabitants are deported, from which we get the phrase, the 10 lost tribes of Israel. You ever heard that, the lost tribes of Israel? It's the tribes of the north. They're no longer in the Holy Land. They're no longer in the Promised Land. They are sent away. So, in chapter 18, we've got Hezekiah as the king of the south. And they are very weak, and it looks like they're going to be taken too. And then it says in verse 13, in the 14th year of Hezekiah, Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, and your footnote there will say Sennacherib succeeded Sargon. On the previous page, it'll say Sargon succeeded Shalmaneser, who succeeded Tilgath-Pileser. So those are the 4 kings of Assyria during this time. Anyway, he lays siege to Jerusalem. So it looks like the south is going to fall as well. And now we do hear this account also in some of the prophetic books that come up. But beginning in chapter 19, Hezekiah has one of the prophets as his advisor, and that man is named Isaiah, whom you are familiar with because he's a prophet who has a book named after him later. And Hezekiah is one of the few prophets who listens, or one of the few kings who listens to advice from the prophets. It looks like all is lost and they're going to be destroyed. It talks in 2 Chronicles, it says one of the reasons that they're able to hold out is Hezekiah had overseen this construction of this tunnel under the city so that water came in. They had a tunnel to bring water into the city. So the Assyrians thought they'd have to give up because they'd starve, but they didn't starve because they had a water supply that the Assyrians didn't know about. And secondly, it says that Isaiah says, no, God's going to save us yet. So, because the king of Assyria sends a delegation saying, surrender. So we don't have to conquer your city and destroy it. He says no, and then it says, suddenly a bunch of Assyrian soldiers die. So apparently some sort of sickness, plague hit, and the Assyrians discontinue their assault on Jerusalem and go back home. And Jerusalem is saved, at least temporarily. After they get back home, the king of Assyria is assassinated, and his successor doesn't come back to Jerusalem to take it. So Jerusalem is saved. So that is what chapter 19 is about, Hezekiah and Isaiah protecting Jerusalem. So Asa was the first good king, and now Hezekiah was faithful. And then he has an illness in chapter 20. It looks like he's going to die, but he lives another 15 years yet after that. When he does finally die, again it says, the rest. Chapter 20, verse 20. The rest of the acts of Hezekiah, all his valor, and his construction of the pool and conduit, by which water was brought into the city, are written in the book of Chronicles. And then the endnote on the bottom, it says where you can look that up. Hezekiah's temple, 2 Chronicles 32:30. However, he dies and his son Manasseh succeeds him, and Manasseh is one of the worst kings. It says he takes over when he's 12 and he reigns 55 years. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, following the abominable practice of the nations and other nations. Rebuilds the high places which his father destroyed. Erected altars to Baal, set up sacred poles, all these things, worships all these other gods. So he does all these bad things, violating the beliefs of their religion. And after he dies, then Ammon takes over. It says he also does evil, follows the path of his father. Then, when he dies, we get the final good king, a guy named Josiah, in chapter 22. He's only 8 when he comes over, and his mother takes charge. He's obviously not running the country when he's 8, but his family does until he's old enough. It says he reigned 31 years, so he dies when he's 39. But he wants to do some reforming, and one of the reasons for that is one day they are doing some work in the temple. He's assigned, basically, like if I told you, clean church and fix some things up in church. It's been a long time since we did that. Okay, remember, the temple is very large. Anyway, they go in there and they're working, and they come across this book, and they read through it, and they say, no, we're not doing what this book says. I wonder if this is real. They bring it, show it to the king. The king says, we got to find a prophet, and he mentions a prophetess, a woman named Huldah. They bring her in, and they say, is this book legitimate? And she says, yes, it is, and we are not doing what it says we should have been doing. Some people think maybe it was the book of Deuteronomy. But yeah, we're in trouble. We haven't done any of the stuff that it says we should have been doing. we've totally gone astray. And she forecast the destruction of Jerusalem. Josiah does some good things in chapter 23. I think he is king from 640 to 609 BC. So he does some good things, but then when he dies, the next guy's again, so chapter 23, verse 32, the new guy again does evil in the sight of the Lord just as his forebears had done. All right, and then look at Jehoiakim, the last part of chapter 23. All it says is he was 25 when he took over. He reigned 11 years. His mother's name, his daughter's name, he did evil just as his forebears had done. So that's all they have to say about him. Then we have Jehoiakim, Jehoiakim, and now we have the worst chapters in the history of the Bible for the Jews, chapter 24. During his reign, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, moved against him. So, in 721, Assyria had taken over Israel. Okay, and now, in 612, Assyria was taken over by Babylon. So now Babylon is the power in the area. And maybe you've heard of Nebuchadnezzar before. You studied him maybe in school. What's he known for even today? His wife missed home, so he built for her the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. You know, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world.
What's Babylon now?
Iraq. Assyria would be in that area, the northern, but yeah, and I have that in there about Assyria. Today there is a country called Syria, but Babylon would be northern Iraq. And anyway, they have taken over the Assyrian Empire, and now Nebuchadnezzar says, basically, you pay me tribute, and then I won't overtake you. So they do that for a while, but then some of these kings try to avoid that. Some of them are thinking, maybe we should make an alliance with one of these other countries. If you read some of the prophets, sometimes they'll say, don't trust in chariots or horses, or in Egypt. Some people are saying, let's align with Egypt. Maybe they can help us against Babylon. But Egypt has become very weak by now. Babylon hears that they're trying to plot against them and be rebellious. So Nebuchadnezzar moves on the city and makes them very, very weak. And in chapter 24, verse 10, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, attacks Jerusalem. The city came under siege. And as time goes on, in about 597 or 8, Jerusalem is rendered pretty helpless. Some of the people are sent away. And here it says in verse 11, he arrived at the city while his servants were besieging it. Some people tried to get away. Some surrendered. They were taken captive. He, meaning Nebuchadnezzar, carried off the treasures of the temple of the Lord and those of the palace, broke up the gold utensils in the temple. In verse 14, deported all Jerusalem, all the craftsmen, the army. None were left in the land except the poor. So that is 586 or 7 BC, the low point in Jewish history. Babylon conquers Jerusalem. They try to withstand that. In chapter 25, it gets worse. I guess what I just said is 597. Now chapter 25, after there's some intrigue, they're still trying to get some independence back or revolt. Nebuchadnezzar finds out about it. They capture the king when he's trying, in name king of Judah, it doesn't have any significance, but they're trying to escape, so they figure that's an attempt at revolt. They have the king's son slain, they blind him and take him off to Babylon. And then the rest of chapter 25 talks about how the king of Babylon destroys, chapter 25, verse 9. He burned the house of the Lord, meaning the temple. So a temple which was built in the 900s BC is destroyed in 586 or 7 BC. That's your exact answer for how long it lasted. Also burns the palace of the king and all the houses of Jerusalem. The entire city was destroyed by fire. They tore down the walls. Every important city had walls around it. People were deported except for the country's poor, who were left behind to take care of vine dressers and farms. the pillars of the Lord, all that, everything's destroyed. That chapter or paragraph, verses 13 through 17, talks about all the other destruction. And then the Babylonians appoint a local governor there for a little while, and then he's replaced, and this Jehoiakim is alive, but he's forced to live under Babylonian supervision in Babylon, which is, their headquarters was modern northern Iraq. But now that empire at this time goes from Iraq through Iran and Lebanon and what is now Israel. So that is why it says somewhere that this could be called the rise and fall of Israel. Because we started going into the promised land under Joshua. We get stronger under David. We've got happiness for the 12 tribes. We've got a good amount of land. Then we have a division into two parts. One part gets taken over by Assyria, and now in 586 or 7 BC, Judah, including Jerusalem, gets taken over by Babylon. The promised land is lost. So that is the low point of the Bible. 1 and 2 Chronicles, we can probably summarize in 10 minutes because it's pretty much the same events. So we can do that at the start next time if you want. But 1 and 2 Chronicles is what was referred to whenever a king died and said other things about him were in the book of Chronicles. So yeah, you can shut it off.